Before everything else had a name, she was already there, not as a monster, not as the enemy, as the beginning. Her name was Tiamat, and she created the gods who would one day kill her. She loved them. She defended them when their own father wanted them dead. She became their world, quite literally, gave her body to be the sky above their heads and the earth beneath their feet. And then, because power is a river that always flows away from its source, they turned on her, slaughtered her, split her open, hung half of her as the sky and pressed the other half down as the earth, and called what they had built an act of heroism. You have been walking on her bones your entire life. That is the story buried at the bottom of the oldest creation myth ever committed to writing. Not a monster's rampage. A mother's betrayal. The first betrayal, if you believe that stories have a beginning, and that this is where ours started. And tonight we are going back to the very beginning. Past. Everything we call history. Past civilization. Past language itself. To find out what they left out of the version everyone knows. Come in close. The lights are low. The world outside has gone quiet. We have a long way to travel, and we are in no hurry at all. There is a kind of darkness that most of us have never experienced. Not the darkness of a room with the curtains drawn, not the darkness behind your eyes when you close them at night. Something older than that. A darkness that the ancient Babylonians called the time before names, the moment when nothing had yet been named, which in their understanding meant nothing had truly come into existence yet. To name a thing was to call it into being. To speak a word was to create a reality. In that unnamed darkness, there was only water. Two kinds of water. Beneath everything, pressing up through the ground, running through the roots of the world in channels no one would ever see. That was the sweet water, the fresh water, the underground ocean that the Akkadian-speaking people of ancient Mesopotamia called Apsu. Above, visible, limitless, where the horizon dissolved into salt and spray, and the deep sea hid its secrets. That was Tiamat. The Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic, begins with one of the most beautiful sentences ever set down on clay. Its opening lines have been translated many ways, but the shape is always the same. When the skies above were not yet named, and the firm ground below had not been called by name, at that moment there was only Apsu and Tiamat, and their waters mingled together as a single body. No reed marsh had broken the surface. No pasture land existed. Not one of the gods had been formed. Not a destiny had been written. Not a name had been decreed. And then, from the mingling of those waters, the gods were born. Sit with that image for a moment. Not a god who spoke the world into being from a distant throne. Not a craftsman who shaped matter with divine hands while standing apart from it. Two bodies of water, touching, and from that touch, life. Creation as an act of contact. The universe beginning not in command or violence, but in union. Tiamat's name is worth pausing over. Scholars have traced it to the Akkadian word tamtu, which simply means sea. The Assyriologist Jeremy Black, in his Dictionary of Mesopotamian Gods and Symbols, gives this derivation plainly. But the scholars Thorkild Jacobson and Walter Burkert traced the roots deeper, noting that in its oldest vocalized form, Tiamtum, the name resonates with a Sumerian ancestry that carries inside it something like the life water, or the mother of waters. The Greek word thalassa, the sea, shares its lineage. So does the Hebrew word tehom, which appears in the second verse of the very first chapter of the book of Genesis. The Spirit of God hovering over the face of the deep. Tehom, Tiamat, the deep, the primordial mother. We will come back to that thread because by the time this story ends, it will have reached further than you might expect. She is not gone. She just became something we stopped knowing the name of. There is something else worth noting about the world the Enuma Elish describes before any story begins. Scholars who study the geography of ancient Mesopotamia have pointed out that the mixing of fresh and salt water described in the poem is not imaginary. It is a real phenomenon, still visible today, in the region where the Tigris and Euphrates flow into the Persian Gulf. That estuary where fresh river water and salt sea water press against each other, the lighter fresh water riding over the heavier salt, never quite mingling. The ancient Sumerians watched this happen every day. They built their first cities near it. When they reached for the deepest image they could find for the origin of all things, they reached for that, the place where the waters met. Tiamat was not invented. She was observed. The gods that emerged from Apsu and Tiamat were, to put it gently, a handful. The first pair were Lahmu and Lahamu, whose names relate to the Akkadian word for silt, the residue left when the waters mingle. And from them came Anshar and Kishar, whose names mean the whole sky and the whole earth. From Anshar and Kishar came Anu, the sky god. From Anu came Ea, the god of fresh water and wisdom and magic. Each generation louder, each generation more energetic than the last. More divine children, and then the children of those children, all of them milling around inside the primordial space that was Tiamat's body. All of them creating exactly the kind of commotion that young gods naturally create. They ran. They shouted. They were, in the text's memorable phrasing, disturbing the belly of Tiamat, stirring up her waters, making waves, filling the silence that had existed before with noise and movement and the general chaos of new life getting used to being alive. Apsu had had enough. He went to Tiamat and proposed that they destroy the whole lot of them, wipe out their children, return to silence, reclaim the peace they had known before any of this began. And here is the moment most popular retellings skip over, because it inconveniently complicates the narrative they want to tell. Tiamat refused. The text of the Enuma Elish is explicit and unambiguous. When Tiamat heard what Apsu proposed, she was furious. She cried out at him, "How can we destroy what we have given birth to? Their behavior may cause us distress," she said, "but let us hold on. Let us respond with discipline, not with murder. This is not the reaction of a chaos monster. This is the reaction of a mother." And she was right. Apsu went ahead with his plan anyway, talked into it by his vizier Mumu, the god of mist, who apparently had less patience for children than Tiamat did. And Tiamat, for a time, simply let it go. She suppressed what the text calls the evil in her belly. She swallowed her anger. She held herself together. She continued to exist alongside gods who were a genuine nuisance to her peace because they were her children. She loved them, even when loving them was difficult. Remember this. It is the hinge point of everything that follows. Ea, the cleverest of the young gods, discovered Apsu's plot before it could be carried out. He was not the kind of being who waited to be acted upon. He cast a sleeping spell over Apsu, and when Apsu lay motionless and powerless, stripped him of his divine radiance, took his crown, and killed him. Then Ea built his palace on the conquered waters of Apsu's body and moved in. He and his wife Damkina settled there in the chambers of their dead ancestor, and it was in those chambers that Marduk was born, four-eyed, four-eared, surrounded by the light of his own divine radiance, the child who would one day be given the whole sky. Now, this is the moment most retellings of this story leave out entirely. After Apsu's death, Tiamat did not immediately declare war. She did not rise from the deep and begin destroying everything in sight. She grieved. She sat quietly with her grief. And for a significant stretch of time, while other gods came to her, complained loudly, pressured her, told her she was too mild, told her she looked weak, told her the young gods had overrun everything that was rightfully hers and her murdered husband's, Tiamat did nothing. It was not her own anger that finally broke her. It was theirs. The older gods went to Tiamat and turned up the heat. "You are too patient," they told her. "You are too lenient. You have no spine. Your husband is dead and you did nothing. You are an embarrassment to everything you were." And eventually, after pressure that the Enuma Elish describes at considerable length, Tiamat relented. She would give them their war. This is the moment I was pointing toward, the hinge the story has been building to. Because this distinction changes everything about how you hear what comes next. Tiamat did not start this fight. She is not the aggressor in any simple sense. She is a grieving widow who was manipulated into violence by gods who resented the new order and needed someone powerful to put herself in front of it. The story of the Dragon Mother is not a story about chaos seeking to destroy order. It is a story about a mother who was pushed slowly and deliberately past the point where she could hold herself together. Mythology has always been extraordinarily good at burying the complicated version under the simpler one. When Tiamat finally turned toward war, she did not do it halfway. She created an army, not soldiers in any ordinary sense, but something older and stranger. The Enuma Elish describes 11 creatures she brought into existence from the depths of herself, filling their bodies not with blood, but with venom, clothing them with terror, making them of lofty stature. Whoever beheld them, the text says, terror overcame him. Their bodies reared up and none could withstand their attack. The 11 are named Basmu, the venomous snake; Ushumgalu, the great dragon; Mushmahu, the exalted serpent; Mushushu, the furious snake; Lahmu, the hairy one; Ugalu, the great weather beast; Uridimmu, the mad hound; Gertablulu, the scorpion man; Umu Dabrutu, the violent storms; Kululu, the fish man; and Kusarikku, the bull man. The Gertablulu, the scorpion man, appears elsewhere on the cylinder seals of ancient Babylon, stationed at the gates of the sunrise, guardian of the threshold between the known world and the place where light comes from. To call that creature into an army was not to invent darkness. It was to conscript the guardian of the dawn. Picture them for a moment, not as fantasy creatures from a game or a film, as the concentrated dread of a civilization that lived beside an unpredictable river and knew, from painful experience, that the deep water hid things it would never fully understand. Scholars who study Mesopotamian iconography have noted that several of these figures appear elsewhere in the archaeological record, on cylinder seals, on temple gates, on amulets worn for protection. The Scorpion Man was a known figure at the boundaries of the world, a guardian of cosmic thresholds. These were not pure inventions of evil. They were creatures that belonged to the margins, to the liminal spaces between the ordered world and whatever lay beyond it. Tiamat, in summoning them, was calling up the world's own strangeness and arming it with her grief. She also appointed a commander, Kingu, sometimes rendered Chingu in older translations, who was, in the logic of this myth, simultaneously her son and her new consort. Ancient mythology did not always hold the same boundaries we do, and Tiamat's elevation of Kingu was understood not as transgression, but as an act of supreme authority. she was crowning someone. She gave him the Tablet of Destinies, the sacred relic that conferred the power to fix the fates of gods and mortals and everything between. The Akkadian word for destiny, Shimtu, carried meanings that spill beyond our modern concept. It included the physical nature of a thing, its place in the grand design, its very existence as what it was. To hold the tablet was to hold the power not just over events, but over the nature of reality itself. Tiamat clasped it around Kingu's chest, declared him king above all gods, and sent her army forward. The gods panicked. Ea tried to speak with Tiamat and failed. Anu, the sky god, the oldest divine authority, and the one whose dignity was perhaps most at stake, was sent to negotiate next. He turned back before he reached her, could not face her, could not match her power, walked home considerably diminished. The gods held their famous council, which the Enuma Elish describes with a warmth suggesting that even the oldest literature understood the specific quality of anxiety that comes from watching every plan fail in sequence. They ate, they drank. They got, by the text's implication, somewhat past the point of strategic clarity. Eventually, Marduk stepped forward. He would fight Tiamat. But he had a condition. If he won, he would be made supreme, king of every god. His word would be law, his command unquestionable, his authority greater than anything that had come before. Before the battle even happened, the gods in assembly voted him the power to shape the universe. They tested his word. A constellation vanished at his command, then reappeared. The gods were satisfied. They had seen what they needed to see. They agreed. They had no choice. Here is where the Enuma Elish stops being a creation myth and becomes something more interesting, a piece of conscious political theology. Marduk was not, historically speaking, the supreme deity of Mesopotamia. He was the patron god of Babylon. Before the Babylonian, empire rose to regional dominance across the 2nd millennium BCE. The chief deity of the Mesopotamian world was Enlil, the great Sumerian storm god, whose sacred city was Nippur. There are earlier versions of this story in which it is Enlil, not Marduk, who champions the young gods and defeats the primordial mother. There is an Assyrian version in which the champion is Assur, the patron deity of Nineveh, because every major city in ancient Mesopotamia understood the cosmic order to flow through its local deity, and no myth survived long without being adapted to serve that purpose. What the scribes of Babylon did, and this is broadly the consensus of scholars from W.G. Lambert to E.A. Spicer, was take the existing mythology and perform a theological promotion. Every one of Marduk's 50 names at the end of the Enuma Elish is a title drawn from an older deity. The number 50 was the number of Enlil. Marduk absorbs it. The weapons he uses in battle were originally associated with the storm god Ninurta, whose exploits against chaos monsters predate the Babylonian version of this story by centuries. The net, the evil wind, the bow, the arrows. Ninurta's tools, assigned to a new champion. The Enuma Elish was recited publicly every year at the Akitu, the great Babylonian New Year festival. 12 days in spring, timed around the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates. On the 4th day, a priest recited the entire poem aloud, from the first waters to the 50 names of Marduk. On the 5th day, the king of Babylon entered the sanctuary and was stripped of his crown and his staff. He knelt. He declared himself innocent. He received his symbols back from the god's statue. The whole ritual demonstrated, once a year, where power actually lived, not with the king, but flowing through him from Marduk, who had earned the right to distribute it by defeating chaos at the beginning of the world. The myth was the machinery of empire. The reframe that this delivers is worth naming directly, because it is the second thing this script has been building toward. When we read the Enuma Elish as it has survived to us, in copies found in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's great library in Nineveh, in fragments from Ashur and Kish and Sultan Tepe, we are reading Marduk's version. We are reading the account assembled by his priests in the service of his empire for the purpose of his glorification. We do not have Tiamat's version. No text written from her side has survived. What we have is the story told by the people who killed her and built a civilization on her bones. Marduk prepared carefully. He armed himself with the net Anu had given him, wide enough to encompass an ocean. He summoned the south wind, the north wind, the east wind, the west wind, and added to those the evil wind, the whirlwind, the hurricane, the sevenfold wind. Lightning crackled before him like a herald. He rode a storm chariot pulled by creatures with names like Killer and Relentless and Trampler and Swift. When they met, Tiamat screamed. She opened her mouth to swallow him, and Marduk, at exactly that moment, sent his evil wind directly into her open mouth. The wind drove into her body and bloated her from inside. She could not close her mouth. She could not speak. She could not direct her army. He shot an arrow. It went down her throat and split her heart. She was slain. Her army scattered. Kingu was captured. The tablet of destinies was pulled from his chest. The 11 creatures were chained, and Marduk stood on the body of the primordial mother, the being who had existed before all names, who had refused to let her children be killed, who had been pushed past grief into war, and raised his mace. What comes next in the Enuma Elish is the passage most people have never heard. The part that changes the meaning of everything that precedes it. Marduk split Tiamat's body in half. The text describes it with the same quiet precision that a craftsman brings to their work. He sliced her like a fish for drying. He lifted one half and made the sky from it, pulling it up and holding it like a canopy above the earth, setting guards at its edges to make sure her salt water could not escape. He took the other half and pressed it down as the ground beneath everything. Then, working with the body of the being who had created all things, he ordered the world from her. He raised mountains from Tiamat's udder. He pierced her eyes. And the Akkadian word here is Inu, which means both eyes and springs, a single word carrying both meanings, so that her weeping became the source of every river. And from those two piercings the Tigris and Euphrates began to flow. He twisted her tail up and tied it to the heavens, where it arced across the night sky as the band of stars we call the Milky Way. He gathered her spittle into clouds, into rain, into mist and fog. He built the vault of the sky from her ribs. He used her liver to mark the position of the pole star. Think about what this means. The world is not something built around you. The world is Tiamat herself. The sky you have looked up at your entire life is her body, held over you like a canopy of ancient flesh. The mountains on the horizon are what remains of her when the motion stopped. The rivers that watered the first farms, that carved the valleys that held the first cities, that made civilization possible in what is now Iraq and Syria and the shores of the Persian Gulf, the Tigris, the Euphrates, they did not spring from some neutral geological origin. They poured from her eyes. Her weeping is the source of every spring. And here is the thread I said we would return to, the one that connects Tiamat to texts far beyond the borders of Babylon. The Hebrew word tehom, which appears in the second verse of the book of Genesis, the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the deep, shares its linguistic root with Tiamat. Most contemporary scholars are careful not to claim direct literary borrowing, but they broadly agree that the concept of a primordial saltwater deep at the origin of all things traveled from Mesopotamian cosmology into the surrounding cultures of the ancient Near East, filtered through Canaanite tradition, and arrived in Hebrew as Tehom, in the text that tried perhaps hardest to move past the idea of the world as the body of a goddess. The text that presents creation as an act of pure divine will. No conflict, no corpse. She is there. Second verse. Waiting. This is the detail that tends to stay with people. The kind of thing that comes back to you days later while you are crossing a bridge over a river or lying in the rain, and something shifts, and you think, that used to be someone's tears. Here is what it means to live in the world the Enuma Elish describes. For the ancient Babylonians, the physical world, sky, earth, rivers, mountains, was not something separate from the divine. It was divine substance, literally. The cosmos was a body. To live in the world was to live inside a being, and that being had a history. She had loved her children before they had the power to hurt her. She had held back the violence she was capable of for longer than most beings would have. She had been pushed past grief into war, had lost, had been transformed, not erased, not forgotten by the world itself, but pressed into new shapes and put to new uses by the beings she had made. She loved them first. Before any of them had the power to betray her, she refused to destroy them. She chose them. That choice is the ground beneath your feet. Every year at the Akitu festival, the Enuma Elish was recited aloud. Every year, Marduk's victory was celebrated. But there is a reading of that annual ritual that the Babylonians themselves may have understood better than we do. The victory had to be reenacted because it was never truly permanent. The chaos had been ordered, but it was still there, held back by the ribs that formed the vault of heaven, held back by the guards posted at the edges of the sky to keep her salt water from breaking through. Tiamat was defeated, not destroyed. She was the world. She would always be the world. The German word for this pattern in world mythology is Chaoskampf, the battle against chaos. Scholars of comparative religion have traced it from Babylon to Canaan to Greece to the Norse tradition. Baal fighting Yam, the sea god of the Canaanites, Zeus defeating Typhon, Odin and his brothers slaying Ymir, the primordial frost giant, whose blood became the seas, whose flesh became the earth, whose skull became the sky, just as Tiamat's body became the Babylonian cosmos. The roof of the Babylonian sky may be literally nothing other than the upper half of Tiamat, just as the Norse sky is simply Ymir's skull, set in place and held. The pattern runs so deep across cultures that it seems to express something fundamental in how human beings have understood the transition from formlessness to form. What makes Tiamat's version distinct is the detail that precedes the battle. Ymir does not love the gods who kill him. Typhon attacks from pure destructive hatred. But Tiamat, in the text we have, refused to kill her children when she had every reason to. And the world that was built from her body carries that history inside it. That is not a comfortable cosmology. It is an honest one. This reading of Tiamat, as mother, as creator, as the being whose grief became the rivers, has attracted scholars with very different agendas, and it is worth knowing what they argued and why the argument is not settled. There is a debate worth visiting briefly because it has shaped how Tiamat has been understood in the modern world. In the mid-20th century, the British scholar Robert Graves proposed that Tiamat's defeat was evidence of a historical shift from an older, goddess-centered religious worldview to a newer, male-dominated one. The myth, in this reading, was not just cosmology, but a coded record of a social revolution. This idea was later developed by Merlin Stone in her 1976 book, When God Was a Woman. To this school of thought, Tiamat's slaying was the mythological expression of a real patriarchal takeover. It is a compelling reading. It is not, however, one that most mainstream historians and archaeologists accept as historically demonstrated. The earliest Sumerian inscriptions, while they include powerful female deities, among them Namu, who created the cosmos without a male partner, and Inanna, whose priesthood produced the world's oldest signed literature, do not depict a world in which female deities were supreme and male ones secondary. The claim of an original matriarchal paradigm requires evidence of that earlier world, and that evidence has not emerged in the archaeological record. What the evidence does support, and this is more interesting than either the full feminist mythology or its dismissal, is that the author of the Enuma Elish was working with older traditions that portrayed a nurturing, creative female principle at the origin of all things. They combined that figure with the volatile, dangerous capacity of the sea and produced Tiamat, a being who carries both the earliest maternal power and the terrifying unpredictability of deep water. She is not purely good or purely evil. Neither verdict fits her. She is the ocean, the thing that makes civilization possible and the thing that drowns it. Given a face, given a history, given a moment where she chose patience over violence. That choice was not permanent, but it was real, and it was hers. The story does not give us a verdict on Tiamat. The scholars who have studied it most carefully have not given us one either. What she represents is still an open question, still being turned over, still yielding new readings as new fragments emerge from the ruins of cities that no longer exist. That is, in a way, the most honest thing you can say about the oldest story in the world. It is not finished. The story is finished now, or rather, it has arrived at the place where stories like this one do not end so much as open out, into the sky, into the earth, into the rivers you have crossed 100 times without knowing whose eyes were once behind them. Before everything else had a name, she was already there. That sentence is still true. The dome you have looked up at your entire life is her body, split and pinned above the earth by someone who needed her matter more than they feared her memory. The mountains on the horizon are what remains of her when the motion stopped. The rivers that carved the first valleys of civilization still run south toward the Gulf from eyes that once wept. She loved them first. Before any of them were powerful enough to hurt her, she refused to let them be destroyed. She chose them. And that choice, made before history began, written into clay in a language most people have never heard, is the ground beneath your feet. Rest now. You don't have to carry any of it. The oldest stories survive without our help. If this found you at the right moment tonight, if it gave you something to hold or something to let go of, if it changed the way the dark looks from where you are lying, consider subscribing to Sleepable Mythology. There are more stories waiting, more gods, more mothers, more ancient betrayals that became the world we live in, more names that are still with us even when we have forgotten they are names. Next, from the same world Tiamat made, Inanna, the goddess who descended into the underworld, surrendered everything she had at 7 iron gates, died, and came back. The oldest story ever told about the thing that survives after everything else is stripped away. Good night.